once more, thank you. Established in 2011, Life Science Cafe is organized by graduate student researchers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Each month, we invite experts to share and discuss their research. Typically, we host these events in the Amherst community, but we are continuing our efforts virtually. We would like to thank our funders, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Program, the Graduate Student Senate, and the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our generous UMass Gives donors. Again, my name is Yanis Bermudez, and I will be your host tonight. We are very happy tonight to have with us Dr. Laura Figueroa, who will talk with us tonight on her work, on her bees. Without any more, I'll give the space to Laura Figueroa. Thank you, Yari. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Laura. How are you? Super. I'm very happy. Perfect. So we're going to start. Can you talk to us about you, who you are, and why did you do this career? Of course. I am an ecologist principally. I'm very fascinated about connections and relationships in an ecosystem. And I am very interested in conservation and how systems work literally. Right now, I've done my PhD in etymology, which to work with bees. And I just graduated from Amherst, and I'm now postdoc in environment sustainability. Please talk to me on how you started your professional career and how you developed this interest in your current investigation and research. I have worked in different areas. I've worked in how different snails diversify in urban contexts. I've worked with different bees species. And if the question is, how did you get here in this moment? To me, it's fundamental to think of the collective system. How can we move forward with conservation? Bees have something very specific. They're ecologically very important and even economically very important. And it was an opportunity to work with them when I was in grade and graduate students. And I developed this interest even more because of their importance and this deep relationship with bees. And I want to focus on working with mutual interests. This is why I've continued to work with bees. Laura, another question, how can I say this? You've started your career, but it's not that when you were a kid, you wanted to do this job. It's just an interest that you develop little by little. Well, in fact, when I was little, I wanted to work with snakes. I wanted to work with reptiles, that's all I was thinking of. And still, I'm fascinated by snakes, but this changed because I loved being outside. I loved being in nature. And then I realized when I thought of what do I want to do, not only what I'm fascinated, but what is important for society. That's where in college, I started seeing in a collective way what really matters. And that's how I wanted to principally work with bees and conservation also in particular. So what is the role that your colleagues in your science partners, right, have on you, and especially in this time with climate change? Well, it's a great question, but there's so many problems right now with the ecosystem. It's very easy to feel overwhelmed and wonder, how do I deal with these political structures that maintain so many people marginalized? How can we move forward? So I feel that for a long time, scientists were just focused in science, on science, really. And it has a lot of benefits. Pure science is magnificent. Nonetheless, scientists have, we have a training that is very important for society. We are trained in critical thinking. We are trained in and data and analytics, right? In public relations, we have so many tools and skills that are very, very important and useful for society. We are problem solvers, critical problem solvers with our training. And that's how we can invite people who can participate in science that have historically been marginalized from science, whether formally or informally. I think scientists have a very important role in society. We need to, first of all, make science accessible and basic, both the general, science, but also specific, right? Specific problems. We need to think and address problems that are both local, global, and international, and engage in conversations to amplify our scientific knowledge at a social level. Not at the scientific knowledge is not meant to be just between scientists. It's meant to make people think critically. That's why it's useful, sorry, for everyone, including non-scientific people. And I want you to understand how important it is, not only for scientists, but from outside people outside of that community. If we want to translate the science, right, and we use a lot of jargon, right, that are very hard to translate in general and specifically for just the popular audience, um it's it is hard. But what happens is that we don't train scientists on how to have this dialogue, these conversations with a different audience. We are trained to be technical. So people who are interested in this social change, we really need to take classes and workshops and participate in different events. It's like what you just said, it's very hard, but really, really need to make the effort because it's something we need to do if we want a more inclusive future in which that we would have less social and ecological problems. And this movement, is it large, or do you feel it's something that needs a lot more work, that there's a lot of work involved, and people still need to engage at that level? There are a lot of people that are currently working on this, but there's a lot of work that we need to do to move forward. Because again, ecological and social problems are interconnected within very complex networks that are not going to be solved with one publication, right? It is continuous work, constant work, dedicated work, and interdisciplinary work that would allow us to connect together and move forward together united. Laura, this is very interesting. We could talk about this all night, but I would like to give the chance for audiences to ask questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can ask it in the Q&A section, or you can also use your raise hand option in the inferior part of your screen. Or you can ask a question also in English or in Spanish, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Laura, in the meantime, I would like us to talk about regarding politics and how hard it is to do this. Do you think, how do I say this, that what is happening is global or that it's more territorialized? I think it's both. I think the problems and the important aspect of including scientists to address problems is global. Nonetheless, of course, there are differences, different problems, different sites, right, have different needs, different cultures, and we require the knowledge of every region. For example, I'm from Colombia, and it's fundamental to understand the history of the country to then move forward. A person who do not know and recognize the complexity of the terrain, of the use of the terrain, of the politics cannot come and say, oh, I think you have this issue. Oh, here it is. Here's the solution. You do need a knowledge of every region. For example, I went and worked with an organization, non-governmental, at the south, in the south of India, in an indigenous reserve of tigers. And I felt the opposite. I didn't have enough knowledge about the region. And that's where I realized the importance of the communities themselves being the ones who indicate and tell us what are their problems. And it's part of the most important part of the training. And one of the most beautiful things of this organization is that it trained members of the community, and they trained them as barefoot ecologists, that's how they called them, that are not trained scientifically, but have a scientific knowledge that is just spectacular, right? They know the flora, the fauna, they know the system in a way that an exterior member just doesn't know. And that is the way in which that's what I'm trying to say, right? Regarding your question, yes, it is the same globally. Problems are happening everywhere, but every region is different. We have a question. What is your favorite part of working with bees?
The question is, what's the best part for you to work with the bees? I think the best is the field work. I love to be with the flowers, to be outside. Well, the flowers and the meat, we'll talk about it in a bit about that. But all this work, uh, uh, that bring my own lunch for the field work and to be there to be working hard, it's great. That's my favorite part. Perfect. Okay, so we are gonna talk about um, a little bit more about the bees that you work with. If you, I'm gonna share my screen because in this part, and then I can talk a little bit more about this bees. Okay, whenever you're ready, we can talk about the bees. Even though our audience knows where are the bees are, can you please define a little bit what a bee is? What is the definition of a bee? The bee is an organ, a fascinating organism. Uh, they are a group that includes the ants, and they all are part of in the insect world. Basically, every animal that doesn't have bones, it has six legs. There are many, and they are around 26,000 species. And in Massachusetts, there's about 3,000 of these species. It's very I know when somebody thinks about the bees, they only think about the ones that produce honey, but that's only one of thousand of species, and the majority of them are alone. They don't have a queen. And when I say this, people tend to get very surprised because the majority are mothers, and they go to the flower, they collect pollen, and they do like a little bowl of pollen, and they put the egg, and they close it, and they don't go back and interact. Um, and then what everybody thinks is that everybody working together, and that's only 20% of the species of bees. There's a lot of sizes. There are some that live alone. There are some that are more sociable, and all of that are very different. How you can see in the picture, uh, in the top part, there are some of them that uh, lives in weird spaces. Is really, really interesting to think about this diversity in bees. The majority of time we have focus only on those bees that are very social. In other words, when a bees that you can find in Colombia, for example, is not the same bee that you can find in Puerto Rico? Well, that's a very good question. I, there's a few species that are everywhere and or in different places. They have a lot of range, but there's other species like the honey bee that basically is everywhere because it's been introduced to different places. You can find it in Puerto Rico, Colombia, in Australia. You will find it everywhere. There's other bees that their range, native range is very big, and others are very just live alone. There are some of them called hyleas, and they are specialized in only or you can only find them in a few islands. So that tells us about the diversity because not all of them has the same range. Okay, so to start off, we want to talk about one of your recent works that went viral, the Vulture Bees, meat-eating bees. Can you please tell us a little bit about them? Yes, of course. A lot of people here, they're probably asking themselves, what? Vulture bees? The majority of bees, they get their protein from their bee, from the pollen that produce the flower, and they took the nectar for their energy. That's why the bees go to the flowers. But there's a group and they are specialized and they take their source of protein from the meat. And literally, some of them are specialized and exclusive and exclusively take the protein from the meat. And there's another that eat a little bit of meat, a little bit of pollen, or whatever they can find. So they survive with whatever they can find. So there is a lot of diversity of diets that they can consume. So I can show you here the work that talks about this. I was working in Costa Rica in an organization of tropical studies, and it's a reserve. And basically, we knew that there was this type of bees, vultures bees, but there's very little what is known about their biology. And we know that depends on what we eat, your microbiome are gonna be different, even for us human, even for those who are vegan, they have a microbiome different from that person who eats meat. And if we think about in a more bigger level, like for example, a tiger is going to have a different diet than a zebra. So what we wanted to know if this microbiome was different for bees, for those that eat meat, or it's different for those that go only to the flowers and to the plants. So to do that, as you can see in these pictures, we went to the grocery store and then we bought chicken. We measured them and then we put it in a string uh, in the jungle. And it was very funny because a lot of people will will see the chicken hanging in the jungle, and people were getting scared and things like that. Um, but what we did was to put this in a way that we could put it systematically apart from each other, and in that way find those bees. So I can show you example here when we found a lot of these species, and they are a lot. I don't know if you can see it, but some of them take the meat on their legs and they go to their home. These are more of the social bees. So we collected them and they are exclusively vulture bees, and they both the ones that eat meat and flower and the ones that eat only meat. And then we compare them. So these vultures bees are not aggressive. No, they are not aggressive. And in fact, they are part of a group that they are part of a group that during their life they lost their sting and they really don't bite. Some of them don't have it and it's still aggressive, but and they bite other people. The people, if you get close to them, uh, and that's the way they defend themselves. But the majority are very calm and they are not aggressive. Yeah, and I see the picture that you are behind. They are not small. They have a very good size. They are more or less small, around 1 centimeter. Wow, they look bigger. Okay, so we are going to continue, and the next question I have for you: how how is the relationship between these bees and the bees that we find in our in our patios, in our yard? Well, this as a family of bees, this group is in the group that includes other type of insects, the honey bee, in the family of the honey bee, and it is very different. We don't we don't find these type of bees, for example, at the north of Mexico. Is something that you can find it in areas that are tropical. That's why you're never gonna find this bee, for example, here in Massachusetts. But if you're in Colombia or and even other regions, like for example Australia, um, you can find these bees as well. Do you think these bees, the bees that we have here that normally eat pollen, do you think they can convert and eat meat or maybe other things that we don't know? Well, that's a very interesting question. I want to clarify that these bees are eating meat from other animal or reptiles. I- It's very amazing, but not because of that we have to be afraid of them because they only really eat meat, uh, animals that are diseased. Or so to do a change from that diet, uh, that occurs only in the evolution scale. It's not from one day to another. It requires a lot of time. So we are not gonna see that change from that these bees from here in the yard to start eating meat in our lives. I don't think it's a concern. What benefits and risk have these for these bees to consume this meat? It's a very good question. This is why we did this study. So us to digest different type of food, we need acids in our stomachs, right? So those acids will help break down certain food, and they help in the digestion. So it's the same way. If we were curious about these bees, how do they process their eating and digest this, and how can they do to produce this source of protein, which is very different from the pollen. And what we found is that they had a lot of bacteria from acids that so those this bacteria like acid, and it's very what is very interesting and what we found very fascinating is like if we see uh, another type of animal like crocodiles or other organisms like these bees, they also have this type of bacteria that like acid in their stomachs, which tells us that this is an adaptation that can actually benefit the meat consumption. So they have microbiome that can help them to manage the bacteria that the meat has, and then they can digest. When the meat is going bad, it smells very bad, and if we as human eat that, we'll be getting sick. But they are prepared to manage and to consume this type of protein without getting sick. So so there is a great difference between these bees and the ones that uh, the pollinators. So yes, we have three groups. It's not only this one. The bees, the ones that go to that we think that only goes to the flower. We have the vulture bees that only goes to the meat, and then we have one in the middle that goes to the flower and goes to the meat as well. And we found a different, very in between the vegan one, for to say it some way, and the one that eat only meat. But the one in the middle has the most amount of microbiome, which tell us that really to be able to digest all those sources of protein, you need a lot more of these microbiomes. It's very interesting that these microbiome are are these ones that like the acids, because it's very interesting for me because these bees have evolved a lot, and to be able to do this and not getting sick, it's really interesting and how they are being evolved to that level. So you mentioned before they they don't have uh, they don't have a specification on the type of meat they eat, or they don't know, simply eat. No, in fact there is a study that found that they prefer meat that is very fresh. No meat that is alive, but they prefer meat that is in in, in, in a very early decomposition phase. No one is completely rotten, but they do have some preference to eat. And this study actually this study shows that they can identify this by the way they can smell how the meat smells. So they do actually have a preference of when to eat. Wow, perfect, perfect. Okay, so we're gonna give one more time to the audience to do questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, they can write in the Q&A, or they can press the button by raising their hand to speak. So I think we have a question. It is possible that other bees different from vulture bees, they they could use this meat on this composition for another things. Sometimes at some point, I was working in Colombia studying bees, and we collected different bees.
Súper. Qué lindo trabajar en los Andes colombianos.
Awesome. It's very beautiful to work
Hay
at the Colombian Andes.
de
Yes.
muchas abejas
There are
con
register of many
polen
bees to go into
rojas
source because of the
rojas
salt.
y no
So they
necesariamente
go
están
and they
rojas
don't
en las
necessarily
carnes,
broke
sino
down
van
the meat,
y
but they
prueban
go
si hay
and
sales o
try
diferentes
to see if
minerales,
there's a minerals
por
or
lo cual
salt.
hay un
Uh,
amplio
Therefore, there is
de abejas que pueden
there's a
hacer
lot
eso.
of these
Incluso
bees
hay
that can
registros
do this,
de
and
ahorros
there is
que
also
pueden
records there
visitar en
that they can
en un par
visit
de ocasiones, pero más por los minerales y las sales, más como
that
por
visit the meat
tenerlo
only
conocimiento. Van y
for the
prueban
minerals and
los minerales,
salt,
no
only to
necesariamente están
try them,
consumiendo la carne.
and sometimes don't even consume directly that meat.
¿Cómo crees que podemos los científicos ayudar a formar el pensamiento científico en la comunidad?
How
Creo
do
que
you
es
think that scientifics like us can help form
Pues
scientific knowledge in the
es una
community?
pregunta muy importante
Well, it's a very
y
important
me parece que
question.
lo podemos
What
hacer
I
de
think
diferentes maneras,
that we can
en
do
diferentes
is
escalas.
in different
Entonces,
ways and in
a la
different
escala personal,
levels, right? At a
con
personal level,
nuestra
I
comunidad
think that
activamente
talking
en
to
diferentes
and with our
espacios,
communities
pero
in
si son
different
maneras a
ways,
las que puedes
for
hacerlo
example, if there
desde
are
hablar
schools that you can
con
attend,
miembros de tu familia,
talking with family members and
con las personas
inclusively, you know,
que conoces,
in
es
people
muy
with that you
importante.
know,
Realmente,
it's very important.
yo creo, es mi opinión,
And really,
que
I
el
believe, this is my
conocimiento
opinion,
es algo
that
esencial.
critical thinking is
Y
essential.
creer en la ciencia,
And
que las
to
personas tengan
believe
fe
in
en la
science,
ciencia es algo
that
muy
people have
importante,
faith in
porque
science is
actualmente,
very important because
por lo menos en
now,
Estados Unidos,
at
hay
least in the
una
US,
falta de
there's
confianza
so
en
much
la
lack
ciencia.
of trust
Hay
in science.
escepticismo,
There's
creen muy poco
skepticism,
en la
there's
ciencia. Entonces yo
fear
creo que si
in relation
podemos
to science.
hablar
So
y
I think that
poder
if we can
educar a las
talk and have
personas y
conversations
pensar
and
críticamente,
help people
tanto
to think
niños como
critically,
adultos,
both
esa es una
kids and
forma de
adults,
realmente
that is a
educarlos.
way that
Y hay
is very
estudios que
useful.
muestran
And there's
que si
studies
hay una
that show
relación,
that there's a
si las personas
relationship
tienen algo en
if
común,
people have
si
something
hay
in
como un
common
diálogo,
or can
es
have
más
just a
probable que
dialogue,
cambien
it's
de
more
opinión
probable
versus
that they will
hablando con
change
una
their
persona
opinion
X con la que
than
no
talking
están de
with a
acuerdo.
person X,
Entonces yo
right?
creo que eso es
That they
algo que
have no
podemos hacer
connection
a
with.
escala cercana,
So I think that
pero
this is
también
something that one can
no
do at a small
solo
scale, but
publicando
also
en
please not
artículos
like
científicos,
publishing
sino
scientific
escribir
articles,
a una
try to
revista o a un
write
periódico
for a review, just a
si puedes
newspaper or a
asistir a eventos más
magazine,
grandes,
try
si
to
puedes
go
intentar
to
dialogar
larger events,
con
try
personas
to
que
talk with
están en el
people
gobierno,
that are in the
si no
government,
puede asistir,
that
si
they're
miembros de
events that
comunidades
one
no
can
pueden asistir,
possibly assist
tú
as a
puedes
community
trabajar
member,
con
and it's more
comunidades.
work.
No recibimos
Uh, and we
entrenamiento
don't
para
get that
hacerlo,
training as
pero yo creo
scientists.
que
But I do
parte de tu
believe that
pregunta es
to
muy
answer your
importante.
question, it is
Es
important
importante
to do it,
intentar
to
llegar
try
a
and
todas las escalas.
reach all these levels.
perfecto.
Perfect.
Laura, yo quiero
Laura,
preguntarte,
I want to
estoy muy
ask,
curiosa de tu
I'm
trabajo
very
y de todo
curious
lo que
about your
haces.
work,
Me
and
gustaría saber una,
I want to
dos
know,
cosas. ¿Qué es
there are
lo que
two
te gusta más
questions.
de trabajar con
What
las abejas?
is your
Y
favorite part of
¿tienes
working
alguna
with
anécdota,
bees?
algo
And
curioso que te pasó,
what
algo
is the
que te
most
encantaría
surprising or
que
curious thing that
me
you
encantaría
would like to share with
compartir
us?
experiencias que has tenido en el
I
campo?
would love to know your experience, right? Your stories from the life in the
Realmente
field.
a mí me encanta
Well,
trabajar
really,
con las
I
abejas. Me
love to work with
parecen
bees. I think
hermosas,
they're
me parecen
beautiful. I think
supremamente
they're
importantes porque me
extremely
gusta la
important
fruta,
because I
la
love
diversidad de
fruit.
flores,
I
la
love flower
interdependencia que
diversity that we
existe en las
have
abejas.
in the planet.
No lo
And
tendríamos.
without bees, we wouldn't have it.
Pero sí tengo una foto
But
aquí que
I
quería
do have a
compartir.
photo that I wanted
Que
to share.
no sé si ustedes
I don't know
reconocen
if
a
you
este insecto.
recognize this
El nombre
insect. The
científico
name, the
es
scientific name
Paraponera clavata.
is
El
Paraponela
nombre común se
clavata.
llama
The common
ornitópala
It's ball ant because, or ant ball, because it is the insect that has the most painful bite in the world. People compare its bite with a bullet. That's why it has this name. That's when we were there in the field, it was very common to see these ants. So they were, the worst part was when there was one little bee on the side of the chicken and an ant, like a ball ant on the other end. And our collaborators and I were thinking, oh my God, the bee. But if the ant would, move, we would like, oh my God, no. So it's just very interesting to have to deal with such an insect, that one needs to respect it, it's an anecdote that I wanted to share.
Perfecto. Son una
Perfect.
bala, pero son
And they're
grandes.
called ball, but they're because they're big. Yes, they're huge. I mean, literally, this is like my finger. It's the length of my finger. You can see it there. Compare them with the bees. You can't really tell with the scale, but honestly, there are the we're talking about vulture bees. They're the size of the ant's
Y
head.
estas
I mean,
son
the ants are
poderosas entonces.
like enormous. And these are aggressive then. These, no, they are powerful. They're not necessarily aggressive, but if someone messes with them, oh, they will bite you. So I think, let's say that you need to respect them. Let's put it this way.
Perfecto.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay,
Laura,
so
vamos entonces a
Laura, I wanted to talk a bit more
en las
with the
importancias
dynamic
y
with the bees
trabajo
and the
en tu
future
campo.
direction, right,
¿Puedes
of your
hablarnos
work and your
acerca
research.
de
Could you talk a bit more
cómo ves tu trabajo
how
en
you
el
see your work
futuro y
projected in the
temas que
future, and a bit more
podríamos
regarding what you were saying, right,
Excelente.
regarding field work?
Como
Excellent.
todos
Well,
nosotros,
like
todos en esta llamada,
all of us in this
hemos
call,
pensado mucho
we've
en
thought a
enfermedades
lot
infecciosas.
about
Al
infectious
principio, o sea,
diseases.
no sabíamos cómo se
We didn't
transmiten,
know
y
how
uno tenía miedo de
COVID was
tocar
transmitted.
cualquier
We were
cosa
scared
en
of talking
casa por
anything outside of our
saber
homes
cómo se
because we just
transmitía,
didn't know how
cómo se
it
transmitía
was transmitted,
un
right?
virus.
That this pathogen and
Pero
this virus
mira
was
que es
transmitted.
un virus.
But this is
Realmente
one
todos los
virus.
sistemas
Honestly,
están
all of the
rodeados de
systems
diferentes
are surrounded by different pathogens.
Cuando digo
And one
lo
pathogen, when I say
definimos
pathogen, I'm defining it
sea
like
una
one
bacteria,
agent. It can be a
un
bacteria, it can be a
patógeno,
virus, it can be
diferentes
a
parásitos
trypanosome, it can be
a los
any parasite that affect
entonces
and
básicamente
infect
siempre hay
organisms.
diferentes
So
parásitos,
honestly, there are
pero
always
no
different types
todos
of,
se transmiten de la misma manera.
pathogens, but not all of
Entonces,
them are transmitted in the
por
same
medio del
way.
aire,
Some are
otros
through the
por
air,
medio
some are by
de
indirect
transmisión
contact,
sexualmente.
some are
Entonces,
sexually transmittable
pero
diseases. There are
algo que es
different
muy
ways, right? But
interesante
something that
en
is
las
very
abejas
interesting in
es
bees
que
is that
hay
there
parásitos
are
que
parasites
se transmiten por
that
medio
are
de las flores.
transmitted through flowers. What do I
Entonces,
mean
tú
here?
tienes una
What
abeja,
I
digamos,
mean is
una
that
abeja
if
de miel,
you have a bee,
y
right?
tiene cierto
The one that
parásito
makes honey that
que
has
se
certain
llama, o sea,
parasites,
está enferma, pero
it's
igual ahí
sick,
está
but
saliendo.
it's just
Entonces,
going out and
ese
working,
llega
right?
a la flor,
And it goes to the
y al llegar a
flower
la flor,
and arrives and
esos
lands
patógenos al
on the flower.
defecar o
It actually,
deja
defecates and
o los parásitos.
drops the
Lo que
parasites
pasa
or the
es que
pathogens.
ahora
What
esa
happens is that
flor
that flower
está
now
contaminada.
is
Lo que
contaminated.
ocurre
And what
es que
happens
otra
is
abeja
that
de la misma
another
especie
bee
o
of
de
the
otra
same
especie
species or
puede
another
llegar
species can
y
come, pick up the pathogen,
esparcirla. O sea,
and
la puede seguir
spread it
transmitiendo a
and
otras
keep transmitting it
flores, a
to
otras
other
abejas.
flowers and to other bees.
Entonces, yo lo que
So,
estoy
what I'm seeing and what I study for my
es
thesis
realmente
is
estas
really
redes
these
de transmisión,
networks of
cómo se
interaction.
están
How
transmitiendo
are they
por medio de las
transmitting
flores,
through the
porque
flowers?
tienen que ir a las
Because
flores
they need to go to the
y
flowers,
para
right?
conseguir
they need to go to get their food. And like we mentioned, at least in North America, their protein, right? Their source of protein and their sugar through the nectar. But there's a cost, right? So I was very interested in understanding more how they're transmitted and what we can do to maybe reduce, right, the transmission of these diseases.
¿Y cómo se explora la transmisión
And
de
how do you explore the transmission of these diseases in bees? How do you do this? It's a great question. So for, one of my projects, it was a huge scale. I went to different states and I went like 8 to 12 times. I went to these places throughout the summer and I was picking up bees and freezing them. And through a lab, through molecular techniques, I would identify the presence of different parasites. So it was like a molecular level. But another way that I worked with, that I developed a technique that I developed empirical technique in on the field work was, some photos that I'm sharing here. We had some bumblebees, and what we wanted to see is how they were transmitting through the photos. If we look at the upper left, you see a little tube with some fluorescent orange content. That's what we gave the bees to eat. Then we took the bees on the field and we would give them in a box. They would forage, and we did it with a huge, beautiful, sorry, a great undergraduate group of students. And because we had given them this fluorescent food, we could see if they had defecated with an ultraviolet light. And so here you can see at the lower right photo, what we see like orange in a leaf, that is the feces of the bee. And that is a way that we could observe how they were and where they were depositing those pathogens on plants. And something that is interesting is that we found that bees that were infected had more probability to defecate. So you can imagine that in the system, this, of course, if they defecate more, it spreads more, right? So it's basically that we found very common in these places.
y cuando ellas defecan, ellas
And
prefieren
when they
defecar en
defecate,
algunas áreas
do
específicas
they do it in a
o
specific area,
donde ellas puedan estar.
or
Porque
is just where
anteriormente
they
hablábamos
are?
de las
Because
flores
previously we
y
talked about
evidentemente
flowers
ellas también pueden defecar en
and
las flores.
how they defecate on
Ahí toda la
flowers. And
transmisión
through the
podemos
defecation in
observar
flowers,
es
we have the contamination through flower from flower and
hay
flower and bee.
preferencias en
But
donde
is there some kind of relationship of where they defecate? Well, we don't know for all the species, but at least the honeybee, it prefers to defecate when it's flying, which is more hygienic because at least you can imagine that in the hives we have so many sisters and so many bees that are working in very restricted and small spaces. So can you imagine if one has a parasite in there? I mean, phew, it's like you living with your brothers, your sisters, your siblings, your grandmother, if one person has the flu, it's, you can just assume everybody's going to get the flu. It's just the same with a bee. So when they are healthy, the honeybee, it actually defecates outside of the hive. But we have found that when it's sick, it loses control and it actually defecates inside and in other places. But what we have found is that there are differences between the flowers. So you can imagine that there are flowers that are tubular, right? The way that the bee interacts with this flower and has to go inside is very different with a flat flower, right? That it just goes there and sits. So the way that it interacts with the flower also affects the probability that the pathogen will end in one place or another, and also the size of the bee, right? Smaller bees fit in the tube when they defecate. So when they defecate a lot more inside the flower than outside of the flower. So with all of the feces are, outside of the flower, it access the flower, this, the following bee, and it says, oh, I want to go to this flower, and it's just there, it's very exposed. So there are a lot of differences between the flowers and between the bees. And probably in your research you have seen like pathogens that are more prevalent, right, than others. Oh yeah, there's so many parasites that can infect, um, bacteria, virus, trypanosome, mushrooms. There, there's so many ways that a bee can be infected. And there's also, mites. There are just many, many parasites. I'm sorry, continue. But not all of them have the same prevalence. Not all the bees have infection always, right? There's some that are more serious than others too. And there's certain parasites that if the bee has it, if it has a good amount of flowers and is the bee's not stressed, it's not that serious. But there are other type of pathogens that make the mortality rate a lot higher. They're very different and the impact is very different. And we don't know the impact on the vast majority of species of bees in the world. I have found that 75% in the 75% of the bee species had parasites. But what it is the impact on reproduction, for the maintenance of the population, of the bee population, we don't know. These are next stages to know better what is going on, and a lot more when there are other stressors, right? And we humans, with this transmission of parasites, right? It's just like us, we can get pathogens from insects, right? Like flies can infect humans. Is there something that can happen similarly with the bees that you're studying, and the bees could possibly infect us humans? Well, the pathogens that we understand are parasites that infect bees, are parasites that cannot infect us humans. But there's some parasites, and there's a virus actually that can have that can be infectious beyond bees, right? Like flies and ants. So it's not so much that it will infect us as humans, but it can infect more than one species. Not all the pathogens are super specific. How can we use the information from your research to inform the conservation of bees? And we've talking a lot about the impact of your research. This is a question that is really important to me. And I have a great mentor um, and colleague, Lynn Andler, and we actually released a scholarship or applied for a scholarship to be able to answer partly this question, right? How can we understand the system to improve the health of the bees? So something more very concrete that Professor Adler and her collaborators, her colleagues found is that when they eat the pollen of the sunflower, they do not get infected with a specific pathogen. It's a medicinal pollen in that way, but we don't know exactly what happens. We don't know if it can really be used to help the bee's health. and in the field, right? So partly with this financiation, so to speak, that we hope to obtain, we are hoping to find in the field with, flowers, with what we know, with our scientific knowledge, might have more species like the sunflowers family, and see if that reduces its parasites, it helps its reproduction, if it really helps to make it and create a more healthy community. And this is an implementation of our research that we'd like to do and that we've already started. So if you ask me this question in a couple of years, I hope to have a better answer for you.
Bueno, para terminar, te tengo una
To finish, we have one last question. And what advice can you give to an early career scientist, early, late graduate or student, or somebody that is just starting? I think it's very important that we have to not only focus on one thing, but look things like overall environment. When we are studying this career, these studies, we are working very hard. We're focusing, and we sometimes forget about health balance, and sometimes and then you get overwhelmed. And so I think it's very important that scientists can do self-care emotionally and physically to be able to continue in this work that is so important, and to be able to do it for a very long time, but also to do a training for the whole, not only uh, the academic part, and I do think that's very important, but a lot of training to have conversation, to be a leader, a mentor, and how to talk to the community, think critically, and try to find collaborators in other sources. I think if we are thinking in that way, we can be scientists that can actually take this to a more stable work. And that's one of my advice for a new scientist. All right, so we are going to uh, give the opportunity once more time to the audience, the opportunity to ask questions. You can ask your question by typing in the Q&A or raise your hand to speak. In the meantime, Lara, so while we wait for questions, so you said that that was an advice that you gave us. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us? You said uh, you said you only had one advice, but I'm sure you can provide more. Yes, of course. Uh, have a community is very important, and form communities is very important. I think I am assuming that there's people in this call that sometimes you can feel isolated and that you are alone in this. But I want to tell you that you are not alone, and a lot of people are interested in the same thing in their personal level, in the professional level, and mostly to do these social changes. I think it's very easy to get desperate and lose that goal that we have. But my advice is to look for a community, and try to create collaboration and partnerships so you can continue your PhD, or if you continue your academic, or if you go to a nonprofit, or in the industry, in the politics. There are many ways of doing a very good job, but mostly forming and investing in a community is very important. Thank you, Lara, for these words. I think we all need it, including me. So we don't have any more questions. So we are going to finish this webinar. And thank you, Laura, for being here and share your investigation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And this is how we finish our sixth anniversary with familiar faces. This is our first cafe in Spanish, and we are very excited to share with you. For more information about the cafe, you can check out our website. And if you would like more information about our segments organization at UMass Amherst, you can also check out the link provided in the chat. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to fill out our registration form so we can continue to bring all of our participants the topics you want to hear. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here.